My sister's coming to stay with us after the hospital. She and the baby will live here. My mom already decided, my fiancé said in my apartment. What I did next sent her running in horror. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The apartment sat 3 stories above Lakewood Drive in Duluth, Minnesota, position where the street curved gently toward the frozen inlet. From the west-facing windows, Robert Rowan could see bare maple trees etched against gray winter sky, their branches like veins spreading toward the water. The view wasn't spectacular. It didn't need to be. The apartment represented something more fundamental than beauty. It represented escape. Robert had signed the deed 5 years earlier on a Tuesday afternoon in March, his hand steady as he wrote his name across the bottom of the purchase agreement. The realtor had seemed surprised at his age. 27 seemed young for property ownership in this part of the city, but Robert had come prepared. 15% down. Pre-approved loan. Employment verification from the regional shipping company where he'd worked logistics for 3 years without missing a day. The realtor had smiled then, warmly, like she was proud of him. Robert hadn't told her that he'd grown up in a trailer outside Cedar Rapids, or that his father had drunk himself to death when Robert was 16, or that his mother had remarried a man who'd made it clear Robert wasn't welcome past high school graduation. He hadn't mentioned the 2 years he'd spent sleeping on couches and in his car while working double shifts at a warehouse, saving every spare dollar. Those details weren't relevant to the transaction. The apartment was 800 square feet, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with updated appliances, and a living room with hardwood floors that caught the afternoon light. It wasn't luxury, but it was his. Completely, legally, irrevocably his. And that made it sacred. When Mary Hart moved in 14 months ago, she'd brought houseplants in ceramic pots, framed photographs of her family, and a set of kitchen towels embroidered with small birds. She'd also brought laughter, the kind that filled spaces, the kind that made Robert believe he could share something he'd built without losing it. He'd been wrong. The realization came on a Thursday evening in late January when the temperature outside had dropped to 6 degrees and the windows had fogged with condensation. Robert had come home from work at his usual time, 6:45, his boots tracking salt and slush across the mat by the door. He'd hung his coat on the hook, second from the left, always the same one, and walked into the kitchen expecting the normal rhythm of their evening. Dinner preparation, small talk about their days, maybe a movie later. Instead, Mary stood with her arms folded across her chest, her weight shifted on her left hip in a stance Robert had come to recognize as defensive. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her jaw had that tight set that meant she'd already made a decision and was bracing for objection. "We need to talk," she said. Robert set his keys on the counter, the metal clinking against the tile. "Okay." She didn't move toward him, didn't soften her posture. When she spoke, her voice had a practiced quality, like she'd rehearsed this speech in her head during the drive home from her job at the credit union. "My sister's coming to stay with us after the hospital," Mary said. The words came out in a rush, as if speed would carry them past resistance. "She and the baby will be living here. My mom already decided." Robert's hand was still on his keys. He didn't pick them back up, but he didn't let go either. His fingers rested there, feeling the cold metal, grounding himself in something tangible while his mind processed what he'd just heard. She said it like she was announcing a delivery window, like she was informing him that the cable company would be there between 1 and 4. Robert didn't respond immediately. He'd learned long ago that the first response was usually the wrong one. Instead, he studied the moment, cataloging small details the way he cataloged shipping manifests at work. Pattern recognition, inconsistencies, things that didn't align, the way Mary didn't ask, didn't phrase it as a question or even a request, just a statement of fact. The way she said us, but her eyes didn't quite meet his when she said it, like she knew the word was doing work it couldn't support. The way she stood against the counter with her arms crossed, creating physical distance, like she'd already anticipated his resistance and had armored herself against it. And most telling of all, the way she'd said, "My mom already decided." Not "we decided." Not "Lena and I discussed it." Not I was hoping we could talk about this. My mom already decided. Robert's jaw tightened. He felt something shift in his chest, a kind of cold clarity settling over his thoughts like frost forming on glass. Your mom, Robert said carefully, his voice level and quiet, doesn't live here. Mary's eyes flashed. She exhaled sharply through her nose, a sound of frustration and dismissiveness combined. Don't do that. Don't make this difficult. This is family, Robert. It's temporary. There was that word. Temporary. Robert had heard that word before in his life, usually from people who meant indefinite but didn't want to say it out loud. Temporary roommates who never left. Temporary loans that were never repaid. Temporary situations that calcified into permanent problems. Robert nodded once, slowly. How temporary? Mary shifted her weight. I don't know. A few months. Until she gets on her feet. Lena's never been on her feet, Robert said. It wasn't cruel. It was factual. Mary's face flushed. That's not fair. Neither is this conversation, Robert replied. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. You're not asking me. You're telling me. There's a difference. Because I knew you'd say no. The words burst out of her, louder than she'd intended. She caught herself, lowering her voice again, but the damage was done. The truth had escaped. Robert stood very still. The kitchen light hummed softly overhead. Outside, a car passed on Lakewood Drive, its tires crunching overpacked snow. The sound faded into silence. So you decided, Robert said, to announce it instead. Mary's arms tightened across her chest. This is what people do. This is what families do. When someone needs help, you help them. I agree, Robert said. He moved his hand away from his keys, turning to face her fully. But help doesn't mean surrendering your home without a conversation. Help doesn't mean your mother makes decisions about where I live. Mary's expression shifted then. Something hardened behind her eyes. Where we live, she corrected. We live here, Robert. Not just you. The correction landed exactly as she'd intended it. A claim. A challenge. A redefinition of ownership. Robert felt his pulse steady and slow. This was the moment. The moment when he could see the shape of the thing clearly. The moment when politeness and accommodation ended and consequence began. You moved in 14 months ago, Robert said quietly. I bought this place 5 years ago. There's a distinction. Mary's mouth opened slightly. She stared at him like he'd said something unforgivable. I can't believe you're actually saying that. I can't believe you thought I wouldn't. The silence that followed felt thick, almost physical. Mary's breathing was audible now, quick and shallow. Robert could see the muscles in her neck tensing, the way her fingers dug into her own arms. You're being selfish, she said finally. The word came out sharp and accusatory. This is what marriage looks like, Robert. Compromise. Sacrifice. Family. Robert met her gaze fully, his expression unchanging. Marriage looks like asking. Mary flinched. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but Robert saw it. She'd expected anger, maybe shouting. She'd expected emotion she could deflect or counter with her own. She hadn't expected calm certainty. I'm not fighting about this, she said, but her voice wavered now. Good, Robert replied, because I'm not negotiating. Something changed in Mary's face then. The defensiveness drained away, replaced by something colder. Calculation. Assessment. Like she was seeing him differently now, recategorizing him from ally to obstacle. That look told Robert everything he needed to know. She hadn't expected resistance. And more importantly, she didn't respect it. Mary turned away from him, her shoulders rigid. I need to call my mother, she said, and walked out of the kitchen without waiting for a response. Robert stood alone in the kitchen, listening to her footsteps recede down the hallway and the bedroom door close with a decisive click. He looked around the space he'd chosen, the counters he'd cleaned every Sunday morning, the window above the sink where he'd stood countless times watching seasons change over the inlet. His hands weren't shaking. His breathing was steady. He felt no anger, no panic, no desperate need to chase after her and smooth things over. He felt clarity, and clarity, Robert had learned long ago, was the most dangerous thing you could give a situation that depended on you staying confused. That night, Robert lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Mary slept beside him, or pretended to sleep. He couldn't tell which, and it didn't particularly matter. The bed they shared suddenly felt like disputed territory, another thing that had been his and was now claimed by someone else's assumptions. The ceiling fan rotated slowly overhead, its motor making a faint clicking sound every third revolution. Robert had been meaning to fix that for weeks. He focused on the sound now, letting it anchor his thoughts while his mind worked through the problem Mary had presented. Not the problem of Lena needing help. That was straightforward enough. Robert understood hardship. He understood that life knocked people down and that sometimes they needed a hand getting back up. The problem was the method, the presumption, the architecture of manipulation that Mary had revealed. He thought about Lena Hart, Mary's older sister. He'd met her 4 times over the course of his relationship with Mary. Each encounter had been brief, surface level, the kind of interaction where everyone performed politeness while thinking about leaving. Lena was 32 years old, perpetually between jobs, though Mary always framed it as looking for the right opportunity. She'd worked as a server, a receptionist, a sales associate at various retail stores, never staying anywhere longer than 8 or 9 months. Something always went wrong. A manager who didn't appreciate her, a schedule that didn't accommodate her needs, a work environment that was toxic or demanding or unfair in some unspecified way. Robert had noticed that the problems were always external, never something Lena could control or change about herself. The men in Lena's life followed a similar pattern. Brief relationships that burned hot and ended badly. The last one, according to Mary, had been some guy named Travis who'd left town when Lena told him she was pregnant. Mary had called him a deadbeat. Robert suspected the truth was more complicated, but he hadn't pressed for details. Now Lena was 7 months pregnant, unemployed, and apparently homeless. Or about to be. The details were fuzzy, which Robert found suspicious in itself. When people needed genuine help, they were usually specific about their circumstances. Vagueness was a red flag, and Mary had spent most of their relationship cleaning up after her sister. Rent money when Lena came up short. A loan for a car repair that was never repaid. Once, 6 months ago, Mary had withdrawn $600 from their joint account, the account Robert had stupidly opened at her suggestion, to help Lena make bail after a DUI. Mary had called it a family emergency. Robert had called it enabling. They'd fought about it for 2 days before settling into an uneasy truce where neither of them mentioned it again. But Robert remembered. He'd been raised to remember everything about money. When you grew up with nothing, you learned to track every dollar like your life depended on it, because sometimes it did. He shifted in bed, careful not to disturb Mary. The movement was automatic, considerate, and it struck him as absurd now. He was lying here being considerate to someone who'd just announced she was moving her sister into his apartment without asking. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11:47 p.m., red numbers glowing in the darkness. Robert watched them change to 11:48, then 11:49, time passing in increments, each minute another opportunity to think clearly. He replayed Mary's exact words in his mind. "My sister's coming to stay with us after the hospital. She and the baby will be living here. My mom already decided." That last sentence, that was the key that unlocked everything. My mom already decided. Not, "We should talk about this." Not, "I'd like to help my sister. Can we discuss it?" Not even, "This is really important to me. Please consider it." No, the decision had already been made. By Mary's mother, Darla Hart, a woman Robert had met exactly 5 times, each encounter leaving him feeling vaguely exhausted. Darla was the kind of person who smiled constantly while her eyes calculated. She asked questions that weren't really questions. She offered suggestions that were actually commands wrapped in maternal concern. And apparently, Darla had decided that Robert's apartment, the apartment he'd bought with money he'd earned through years of brutal work, was now the solution to her daughter's problems. Robert felt something cold and focused settle in his chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and reactive and often stupid. This was different. This was the feeling he got at work when he spotted an error in a shipping manifest, when the numbers didn't add up and he knew someone was either incompetent or trying to cheat the system. This was the feeling of seeing a pattern. He sat up carefully, swinging his legs out of bed. Mary didn't stir. Robert grabbed his phone from a nightstand and walked quietly out of the bedroom, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The apartment was dark except for the ambient light from street lamps filtering through the windows. Robert didn't turn on any lights. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water from the tap, and drank it slowly while staring out the window at the frozen street below. A memory surfaced, unbidden. He was 19 years old, sleeping in his car in a Walmart parking lot outside Des Moines. It was November, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. He'd woken up with his breath visible in the air, his sleeping bag inadequate against the cold. His body had ached. His future had seemed impossible. But he'd gotten up anyway. He'd driven to the warehouse where he worked. He'd clocked in on time. He'd done his job with precision and focus. And at the end of the week, he'd deposited his paycheck and added another $200 to his slowly growing savings. Because Robert understood something fundamental. No one was coming to save him. No one was going to hand him a better life. If he wanted security, he had to build it himself, brick by brick, decision by decision, without compromise or excuse. That's what the apartment represented. Not just a place to live, but proof that the work had mattered. Proof that discipline and sacrifice led to something real. And now Mary wanted to give it away to her sister. A woman who'd never made a disciplined choice in her life. A woman who was about to become a mother while still behaving like a child herself. Robert set down the water glass. He opened his laptop on the kitchen counter, the screen's glow illuminating his face in the darkness. He clicked through to the shared calendar he and Mary maintained. Another thing she'd suggested, another small concession he'd made in the name of partnership. He scrolled through the upcoming months. February 3rd, baby shower at Darla's house. Mary had marked herself as attending without mentioning it to him. February 10th, prenatal appointment. Mary had requested PTO from work. Robert hadn't approved it. He wasn't her supervisor, but he'd had no idea she'd taken a day off. February 15th, Elle moves in. Just those 3 words. Elle moves in. No question mark. No discussion marker. Just a simple statement of fact, sitting there on the calendar like it was already decided. Because it was already decided, Robert leaned back against the counter. His jaw tightened. The cold focus in his chest grew sharper. This wasn't about helping Lena recover from childbirth. This wasn't about temporary assistance during a difficult time. This was about control. This was about Mary and her mother reshaping Robert's life to suit their needs, and expecting him to accept it because that's what good men did. That's what family meant. That's what love required. Accommodation. Surrender. The quiet erasure of boundaries until you couldn't remember where you ended and someone else's needs began. Robert had seen this before. He'd watched his mother do it with her second husband, letting him take over her house, her money, her choices, until she was living in her own home like a guest. He'd watched friends fall into relationships where they slowly lost themselves, trading their autonomy for approval until they woke up one day in lives they didn't recognize. He'd promised himself it wouldn't happen to him. Robert closed the laptop. He walked back to the bedroom, moving quietly in the darkness. Mary was definitely asleep now. He could hear the deep, steady rhythm of her breathing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, innocent, like someone who hadn't just tried to fundamentally alter the terms of their relationship without asking. Robert had been taught to be kind, to be patient, to give people the benefit of the doubt. And he'd tried. He'd genuinely tried to build something good with Mary, to create the kind of partnership he'd never seen modeled growing up. But kindness wasn't the same as stupidity. And partnership wasn't the same as submission. He got back into bed, but he didn't close his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the fan click with each third rotation, and he began planning. The next morning arrived with pale gray light filtering through the bedroom curtains. Robert woke at 5:30, his internal clock as reliable as ever. Mary was still asleep, her back to him, one arm tucked under her pillow. Robert dressed quietly, jeans, a thermal shirt, his work boots, and walked out to the kitchen. He started the coffee maker, The familiar gurgle and hiss a comforting ritual. The smell of brewing coffee filled the small space, rich and dark. He made himself 2 eggs and a piece of toast. He ate standing at the counter, looking out the window. The sun wasn't up yet. The street below was empty except for a single car passing by, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Robert finished his breakfast, rinsed his plate, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Mary emerged from the bedroom at 6:15, wrapped in her bathrobe, her hair sleep mussed. She stopped when she saw him sitting there, coffee in hand, clearly waiting. "You're up early," she said. Her voice was cautious. "I want to finish the conversation from last night," Robert said. Mary's expression shifted immediately. The wariness became defensiveness. "I don't want to fight." "Good," Robert replied, his voice calm and even. "Because I'm not negotiating." Her eyes widened slightly. She moved to the coffee maker, pouring herself a cup with her back to him. When she turned around, she'd composed herself, her face arranged into something between patience and condescension. "Robert, I know this is a surprise." "It's not a surprise," Robert interrupted. "It's a decision you made without me. There's a difference." Mary set her coffee down on the counter with more force than necessary. "What do you want me to say? That I should have asked?" "Fine. I should have asked. But I knew what your answer would be." "Then you already knew this wouldn't work?" Robert said. She stared at him. "What does that mean?" Robert leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "It means no one moves into this apartment without both of us agreeing. It means your mother doesn't make decisions about where I live. And it means Lena needs to find a different plan. One that doesn't involve my spare room. The spare room. The second bedroom that Robert used as an office. The room where he kept his desk, his files, his books, the weights he'd bought last year. The room that represented the future, a place for a child someday, maybe if he ever felt secure enough to bring another person into the world. Mary's face flushed. "You're really doing this right now? My sister is about to have a baby. She has nowhere to go. And you're worried about your office?" "I'm worried about being told what's happening in my own home," Robert said. His voice remained level, but something harder had entered it. "I'm worried about the fact that you thought announcing this was acceptable. I'm worried about the fact that your mother has already decided how this plays out. Because someone has to decide." Mary's voice rose. "Someone has to help. Someone has to be the adult here." Robert stood up. He was 6'1", broad-shouldered from years of physical labor, and when he straightened to his full height, the kitchen suddenly felt smaller. He didn't move toward Mary. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. "I'm being the adult," he said quietly. "Adults have boundaries. Adults make decisions together. Adults don't ambush their partners with family obligations and then act offended when there's resistance." Mary's hands were shaking now. She wrapped them around her coffee mug, steadying herself. "You're being selfish. This is what marriage looks like. This is what it means to be part of a family." There was again. Marriage. Family. The words used as weapons, as emotional blackmail, as if invoking them was supposed to erase all questions of consent and autonomy. Robert met her gaze fully, his expression unchanging. "Marriage looks like asking." Mary's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she seemed genuinely shocked, like she couldn't believe he wasn't backing down. Like she'd expected him to fold under the weight of her disappointment, to apologize and accommodate and make himself smaller so she could have what she wanted. "I can't believe you," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't believe you're choosing this apartment over my sister." "I'm not choosing anything," Robert said. "You already chose when you made plans without me." Tears started forming in Mary's eyes. They were real. Robert could tell the difference between genuine emotion and manipulation. But tears didn't change facts. They didn't undo what had been revealed. "What am I supposed to tell my mother?" Mary asked, her voice small now, almost pleading. "Tell her the truth," Robert said. "Tell her this isn't her apartment. Tell her this decision isn't hers to make. Tell her no." Mary's face crumpled. She set down her coffee and pressed her palms against her eyes. "You don't understand what this will do. She'll never forgive me." And there it was. The real heart of the matter. Not Lena's needs. Not the baby's welfare. But Darla's approval. Mary's fear of disappointing her mother trumped everything else. including her relationship with Robert, including basic respect for his autonomy, including the boundaries of their home. Robert felt something settle inside him, cold and final. "Then she'll never forgive you," he said. "That's your relationship with her, not mine." Mary looked up at him, mascara smudged under her eyes. "You'll lose me over this." It was meant to be a threat, an ultimatum. Choose my family or lose me. Robert stepped closer, close enough that Mary had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. When he spoke, his voice was low and absolutely steady. "You already lost me when you decided for me." The words landed like a physical impact. Mary flinched, actually stepped backward, her hip bumping against the counter. "I don't believe you," she whispered. "You don't have to," Robert said. "But tonight, when you call your mother, you'll tell her Lena isn't moving in. You'll tell her this apartment isn't available. And you'll tell her that any future discussions about our living situation go through both of us. Not you. Not her. Both of us." Mary's breath came fast and shallow. "And if I don't, then you're making a choice," Robert said simply. "And choices have consequences." They stood there in the kitchen, the morning light growing stronger through the windows, the space between them feeling wider than 8 feet of hardwood floor. Finally, Mary grabbed her coffee and walked out. She didn't go back to the bedroom. She went to the bathroom, and Robert heard the door lock, heard the shower start running. He stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the water run through the pipes, and he felt nothing but clarity. This wasn't over. He knew that. Mary would call her mother. Darla would call him. There would be pressure, guilt trips, appeals to emotion and duty, and all the soft manipulations that people used when they wanted something from you. But Robert had learned a long time ago that pressure only worked if you let it. If you stayed clear about what was yours and what wasn't. If you remembered that no one could make you give up what you'd earned unless you handed it to them. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and got ready for work. That afternoon, Robert sat at his desk in the logistics office of Northern Freight Solutions, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. The office was open plan, rows of cubicles under fluorescent lights, the constant background noise of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations murmuring about shipping routes and delivery schedules. Robert's supervisor, Tom Greenfield, walked past and paused. "You okay, Rowan? You've been looking at that manifest for 10 minutes without moving." Robert blinked, refocused. "Yeah, sorry. Just thinking." Tom nodded, understanding but not prying. That was one thing Robert appreciated about this job. People cared about the work getting done, but they didn't ask invasive questions about your personal life. You showed up, you did your job well, and everyone left you alone. It was simple, clean. "Take a break if you need one," Tom said, and moved on. Robert saved his work and stood up. He walked to the break room, poured himself coffee from the communal pot, worse than what he made at home, but functional, and leaned against the counter, thinking. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a text from Mary. Instead, it was an unknown number with a Duluth area code. The text read, "Robert, this is Darla Hart. We need to talk. Please call me when you have a moment." Robert stared at the message. He'd never given Darla his number directly, which meant Mary had. And the tone, "We need to talk," told him everything about how this conversation was going to go. He deleted the message without responding. 30 seconds later, his phone rang. Same number. Robert let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, Robert, honey." Darla's voice came through sweet and concerned, like she was calling a friend to check in. "I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a minute to chat?" "I'm at work," Robert said. "So not really." There was a pause. Darla's tone shifted, still friendly but with an edge underneath. "This will just take a second. Mary called me this morning, quite upset. She said you're refusing to help Lena." "I'm refusing to let Lena move into my apartment without being asked," Robert corrected. "There's a difference." "Oh, honey." Darla's voice took on that particular quality of maternal disappointment, the kind designed to make you feel like a misbehaving child. "I understand you're protective of your space, but this is family. This is what people do for family. Surely you can see that." Robert walked out of the break room, heading for the exit. He needed air for this conversation. He pushed through the door into the parking lot, cold January air hitting his face. I can see that you made a decision about my apartment without talking to me, Robert said. I can see that Mary has been planning this for weeks without mentioning it. And I can see that both of you expected me to just accept it. Well, Darla said, her voice cooling by several degrees. This apartment will belong to Mary after the wedding anyway. So I think we both know this isn't just yours, Robert. The words hit exactly as she'd intended them to. A claim, a warning, a subtle reminder that from Darla's perspective, Robert's ownership was temporary, conditional, subject to revision once the marriage made Mary an equal stakeholder in his property. Robert stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the parking lot, his breath visible in the cold air, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a sharp one, the smile of someone who'd just been shown their opponent's cards. Actually, Darla, Robert said slowly, that's not how property law works. Excuse me, the apartment is in my name. I bought it before Mary and I were even dating. Marriage doesn't automatically transfer ownership. And even if it did, we're not married yet. Darla's voice hardened. Don't get technical with me, young man. I'm trying to have a reasonable conversation about family obligations. No, you're trying to tell me what to do with my property, Robert said. His voice stayed calm, but it had gone cold. And I'm telling you no. I see. Darla's sweetness was completely gone now. Well, I suppose we'll see how Mary feels about being with someone who puts his apartment over her family's needs. We will, Robert agreed. And you'll see how I feel about being with someone who lets her mother make decisions about my home. He heard Darla's sharp intake of breath. She wasn't used to being pushed back against. She was used to gentle persuasion working, to guilt being effective, to people like Robert. Young men trying to prove themselves worthy, being malleable. You're making a mistake, Darla said, her voice tight. Maybe, Robert said, but it's my mistake to make. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Robert stood in the parking lot for another minute, his phone still in his hand, his thoughts racing. Darla had played her hand. She'd revealed exactly what this was about. Not helping Lena, not family solidarity, but control, the ability to dictate terms and expect compliance. And she made a tactical error by threatening him with the idea that the apartment would belong to Mary anyway. Because that threat only worked if Robert planned to let the wedding happen. He walked back inside, returned to his desk, and opened a new browser window. He typed in a search, property rights, marriage, Minnesota law. He spent the next 30 minutes reading, learning, understanding exactly what his legal position was, what Mary's claims might be, what Darla could and couldn't do. The picture that emerged was clear. The apartment was his. Completely. Mary living there didn't change that. Marriage wouldn't automatically change it either, though divorce could complicate things depending on how assets were divided. But Robert wasn't thinking about divorce. He was thinking about something much simpler, not getting married in the first place. At 4:30, he left work early, something he rarely did, and drove home. The drive took 15 minutes, traffic light on the Friday afternoon streets. He parked in his assigned spot behind the building and sat in his car for a moment, engine off, gathering his thoughts. Then he went upstairs. Mary wasn't home yet. She worked until 5 at the credit union. Robert used the time to make himself useful. He went to the closet in the spare room and opened the small fireproof safe he kept on the top shelf, the one Mary had seen but never asked about. Inside were documents, important papers he'd collected over the years. Birth certificate, social security card, the title to his car, his college transcripts, 2 years at a community college before he'd had to drop out for financial reasons, but the grades had been good. Tax returns, bank statements, and underneath all of that, the apartment deed. The inheritance paperwork from his Uncle Lawrence, his mother's brother who died 7 years ago and left Robert $30,000. The letter from the attorney explaining the conditions of the inheritance. Robert hadn't known his uncle well. Lawrence had been the family outsider, the one who'd left Iowa for Minnesota and built a modest but stable life as an electrician. He'd never married, never had kids, and when he died, he'd left his savings to Robert with a single condition, spelled out in the legal documents. The inheritance shall be used for the purchase of primary residence. Said residence shall remain in the sole name of the beneficiary. Any cohabitation with non-spouse residents shall result in the forfeiture of inheritance protections and reversion of funds to the estate. Robert had read that clause a dozen times when he first received the papers. It had seemed oddly specific, almost paranoid. But his attorney had explained that Uncle Lawrence had apparently lived with a girlfriend for years who tried to claim ownership of his house after they broke up. Lawrence had learned the hard way about protecting what was his. So he'd written protection into his nephew's inheritance. Protection Robert had thought was unnecessary at the time. Now was the answer to everything. Robert scanned the relevant pages of the inheritance documents. He saved them as PDFs on his phone. Then he composed an email to his attorney, a guy named Paul Brenner who handled routine legal work, mostly real estate stuff, and attached the documents. The email was short. Paul, need confirmation that the inheritance clause regarding cohabitation is still enforceable. Specifically, if non-spouse residents move into the property, what are my options? Please advise. Robert. He hit send. Then he forwarded a copy of the inheritance documents to Mary's email address. No subject line, no message, just the attachment. Let her read the fine print. Let her see that this wasn't just Robert being stubborn. This was legal reality. This was protection built into the very foundation of the apartment's purchase. This was her mother's plan crashing into something that couldn't be manipulated or guilt-tripped away. Robert put the safe back on the shelf and closed the closet door. He went to the kitchen and started dinner. Chicken breast, roasted vegetables, rice. Simple food that required attention. The familiar rhythm of cooking helped settle his thoughts. Mary came home at 5:40. He heard her key in the lock, heard her come in, heard her stop in the entryway. "You're home early," she said. "I wanted to finish our conversation," Robert replied, not turning from the stove. "What conversation?" Her voice was tight. She'd obviously talked to her mother. "The one where you tell me what you decided," Robert said. After talking to Darla, Mary came into the kitchen. Her face was splotchy, like she'd been crying earlier. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked exhausted and furious in equal measure. "My mother says you were incredibly rude to her." "Your mother tried to tell me what to do with my apartment," Robert said. "I declined. She was trying to help. She was trying to find a solution. She was trying to force one," Robert corrected. He turned off the burner and faced Mary. "And you sent her to do it because you thought I'd react better to her than to you." Mary's face flushed. I didn't. You gave her my number," Robert said. "You told her I was being difficult. You set me up for that phone call. Don't pretend you didn't." Mary's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Because you are being difficult. Because you're choosing your space over a baby. A literal baby who needs somewhere to live." "That baby has a mother," Robert said, "who needs to figure out her own housing situation. That's not my responsibility. But I'm asking you." Mary's voice cracked. "I'm asking you to help my family." "You're not asking," Robert said quietly. "You're demanding. And there's a difference." Mary pressed her palms against her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was small and broken. "I sent you those documents. The inheritance stuff. I read them. Good. They're not fair, Robert. They're designed to keep people out. They're designed to make sure you never have to share anything. They're designed to protect what I built," Robert replied. "And yeah, that includes keeping people out who haven't earned the right to be here." Mary's head snapped up. "Haven't earned the right? I live here. We're getting married. Are we?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Mary stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm reconsidering," Robert said. "Because the person I thought I was marrying would have asked me about this. Would have respected that this apartment is mine. Would have cared about my boundaries. And you're not that person." Mary's face went white. "You're threatening me?" "I'm being honest with you," Robert said. "Something you haven't been with me." She started crying then. Real crying, not the manipulative kind. Her whole body shook with it. She sank down onto one of the kitchen chairs and buried her face in her hands. Robert watched her cry. He felt bad about it. He wasn't a monster. But he didn't move to comfort her. Didn't offer platitudes. Didn't apologize for causing her pain. Because her pain didn't change the facts. Didn't erase what she'd tried to do. Didn't make any of this acceptable. After several minutes, Mary's crying quieted to hiccuping breaths. She looked up at him, mascara streaked down her cheeks. My mom said you'd fold, she whispered. She said men like you always do. And there it was. The final piece. The thing that made everything clear. Robert felt something inside him go completely cold and still. Not angry. Not hurt. Just finished. Men like me, he repeated. Mary seemed to realize what she'd said. Her eyes widened. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, Robert said. He walked over to the table and sat down across from her. That's what this whole thing has been about. Your mother thought I was someone she could control. Someone desperate enough for approval that I'd let you move your sister in. Someone who'd sacrifice my boundaries to keep you happy. That's not what she meant, Mary said, but her voice was weak. That's exactly what she meant, Robert said. And you believed her. You thought I'd fold. You thought all you had to do was present this as a done deal, and I'd go along with it because I'd be too afraid of losing you to say no. Mary's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. Robert stood up. I'm going for a walk. When I get back, we can talk about what happens next. But I want you to think about something while I'm gone. What? Whether you're actually in love with me, Robert said quietly, or whether you're just in love with what you thought you could turn me into. He left the apartment without waiting for an answer. Robert walked for an hour through the cold Duluth streets. The temperature had dropped again, down into the single digits, his breath forming clouds in front of his face. He walked past the harbor, past the pier, along the empty winter beaches where ice had formed in beautiful, jagged patterns along the shore. He thought about his childhood, about the trailer where he'd grown up, where every argument had been about money, where every mistake had been punished with either silence or rage, where he'd learned to make himself small and quiet to avoid attention. He thought about leaving at 18 with $800 in a duffel bag, about sleeping in his car, about the warehouse job that had destroyed his back but taught him discipline, about slowly, painfully building something resembling stability. He thought about the apartment, about how it had felt to sign that deed, to hold the keys in his hand, to know that no one could take it from him unless he allowed it. And he thought about Mary, about how he believed they were building something together, about how he'd opened his life to her, shared his space, let her into the parts of himself he usually kept protected, about how she'd repaid that trust by trying to give his home away to her sister. By the time Robert returned to the apartment, it was nearly 8 o'clock. His face was numb from the cold, his fingers stiff even in his gloves. Mary was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at her phone. She looked up when he came in. I've been thinking, she said. So have I, Robert replied. He took off his coat and boots, hung everything up carefully, and sat down in the chair across from her. Not beside her on the couch. The physical distance felt necessary. I didn't mean what I said, Mary started. About my mom saying you'd fold. I was upset. You were telling the truth, Robert interrupted. That's what upset was. That was the real thing underneath all the other things. Mary's face crumpled again, but this time she fought back the tears. What do you want from me? I want to know if you understand why this is unacceptable, Robert said. I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, Robert said. I'm done being treated like someone who doesn't get a vote in his own life. Mary wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. So what happens now? Robert was quiet for a long moment. He'd made his decision on the walk, but saying it out loud made it real. You need to call your mother, he said finally. Tonight. And you need to tell her that Lena isn't moving in here. That this isn't negotiable. That you made a mistake presenting it as a done deal, and you're sorry. She'll be furious, Mary whispered. That's between you and her, Robert said. But until that call happens, we don't move forward with anything. Not wedding planning. Not living together. Nothing. Mary stared at him. You're giving me an ultimatum? I'm giving you a choice, Robert corrected. Set a boundary with your mother, or lose me. That's as simple as it gets. That's not fair. What's not fair, Robert said, his voice level and cold, is what you try to do to me. What's not fair is your mother calling me and telling me this apartment will belong to you anyway. What's not fair is being ambushed with a decision that affects my home and then being called selfish for objecting. Mary's phone buzzed. She looked down at it, then back up at Robert. It's her. My mom. Then you should answer it, Robert said. Mary hesitated, then accepted the call. Hi, Mom. Robert couldn't hear Darla's side of the conversation, but he could read Mary's reactions. The initial defensiveness, the crumbling under pressure, the desperate glances at Robert, silently pleading for him to give her an out. He didn't. "Mom, I can't." "No, listen. Mom, please." Mary's voice rose and fell, struggling against the tide of her mother's expectations. "I understand that, but no, I'm not saying we won't help. I'm saying, Mom." Robert stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at Lakewood Drive, at the frozen inlet beyond, at the life he'd built that was now a crossroads. He heard Mary crying behind him, heard her mother's voice coming through the phone, indistinct but clearly angry, heard Mary trying and failing to assert any kind of boundary. After 5 minutes, the call ended. Robert turned around. Mary was curled up on the couch, her phone on the cushion beside her, her whole body shaking with sobs. "I can't do this," she said between gasping breaths. "I can't tell her no. She's my mother. She'll never forgive me." "Then you've made your choice," Robert said quietly. Mary looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "What? You've chosen her over me," Robert said. "That's fine. That's your right. But it means we're done." "Robert, please." "No," he said. The word was final. "I gave you a chance to set a boundary, to choose our relationship over your mother's control, and you couldn't do it. That tells me everything I need to know." Mary stood up, stumbling slightly. "You can't just end this. We're engaged." "We were engaged," Robert corrected. He walked to the bedroom, opened the top drawer of his dresser, and pulled out a small velvet box. The engagement ring he'd given Mary 6 months ago. She'd taken it off last week to get it resized, and he'd been keeping it safe while they waited for the jeweler. He brought it back to the living room and set it on the coffee table. "We're not anymore," he said. Mary stared at the box like it was a weapon. "You're breaking up with me over this?" "I'm breaking up with you because you don't respect me," Robert said. "Because you try to force a decision on me. Because you let your mother control our relationship. Because when it came down to choosing between her approval and my autonomy, you chose her. I just need more time." "No," Robert said. "You need therapy. You need to figure out where you end and your mother begins. But you don't get to figure that out in my apartment while your sister sleeps in my spare room." Mary grabbed the ring box and threw it at him. It hit his chest and fell to the floor, the box popping open, the diamond catching the light. "I hate you," she said. Her voice was venomous now, all the pleading gone. "I hate you so much." "That's fine," Robert said. He picked up the ring box and set it back on the table. "But you still need to leave. This is my home, too." "No," Robert said quietly. "It's not. It never was. You live here, past tense, but your name isn't on the lease. Your name isn't on the deed. And I'm ending this now before it gets any more complicated." Mary's face went through several emotions: shock, rage, grief, denial, before landing on something cold and calculating. "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe," Robert said, "but I'll regret it in my own apartment." Mary grabbed her purse and her coat. She shoved her feet into her shoes without tying them. She yanked open the door and turned back to glare at him. "You're going to die alone," she said. "Just like your uncle." It was meant to hurt, and it did a little. But Robert had learned long ago that truth mattered more than comfort. "My uncle died with his dignity," Robert said. "That's more than I can say for you." Mary left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Robert stood in the suddenly quiet apartment. He walked to the window and watched Mary emerge from the building below, get in her car, and drive away too fast, her tires spinning on the icy street. Then he sat down on the couch and let out a long, slow breath. It was over, and he didn't feel guilty. The next morning, Robert woke to silence. Complete, undisturbed silence. No one else breathing in the bed beside him. No one moving around in the bathroom. No tension humming beneath the surface of everything. Just quiet. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for regret to hit, waiting for doubt, waiting for that voice in his head that told him he'd made a mistake, that he'd been too harsh, that he should call Mary and apologize. The voice never came. Instead, he felt light, unburdened, like something heavy had been lifted off his shoulders. Robert got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He checked his email. There was a response from Paul Brenner, his attorney, sent late last night. Robert reviewed the inheritance documents. The cohabitation clause is enforceable. If you allowed non-spouse residents to move in, you'd technically be in violation of the inheritance terms. More importantly, given the current situation, you have full legal authority to terminate any occupancy arrangements. No one has tenancy rights unless they're on the lease or deed. Mary's been there over a year, but without a formal lease, she's essentially a guest. You can require her to leave with reasonable notice. Call if you need to discuss. Paul. Robert read the email twice, then forwarded it to his phone. Legal backup, just in case Mary or Darla try to make this complicated. He spent the rest of the morning methodically going through the apartment, identifying everything that belonged to Mary. It wasn't much. She'd moved in light, bringing mainly clothes and personal items. Most of the furniture was his. Most of the kitchen stuff was his. The apartment had been fully functional before she arrived, and it would be fully functional after she left. He gathered her things into neat piles. Clothes in one corner of the living room. Toiletries in a box in the bathroom. Books and photos on the coffee table. He wasn't being cruel about it. He wasn't throwing things around or treating her belongings with disrespect. But he wasn't leaving them scattered through his space either. By noon, everything was organized. Robert texted Mary, "Your things are packed. You can pick them up today between 2 to 5 p.m. I'll be here. Please return your key." The response came 10 minutes later. "I can't believe you're doing this." Robert didn't reply. At 1:30, there was a knock at the door. Robert looked through the peephole and saw Darla Hart standing in the hallway, her arms crossed, her face set in lines of maternal disappointment. He didn't open the door. "Robert," Darla called through the door. "I know you're in there. Open up. We need to talk about this." "No, we don't," Robert said from his side of the door. "Don't be childish. This is about family. This is about boundaries," Robert replied. "And you don't get to come to my apartment and lecture me." He heard Darla's sharp intake of breath. "I have a right to see where my daughter lives." "Your daughter doesn't live here anymore," Robert said. "She can come get her things between 2 and 5. You're not invited. You can't just kick her out. She has rights." "No, she doesn't," Robert said calmly. "I checked with my attorney. She's not on the lease. She's not on the deed. She has no legal claim to be here, and I'm asking her to leave. That's how tenancy works." Darla was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Lower, more dangerous. "You think you're so smart," she said. "You think you can just do whatever you want because you have a piece of paper saying you own this place. But you're making an enemy of the wrong family. Robert, we take care of our own. And we remember." The threat was clear, unsubtle, almost laughable in its transparency. Robert smiled, even though Darla couldn't see him. "Is that all?" "You're going to regret this," Darla said. "Everyone keeps telling me that," Robert replied. "But so far, I feel pretty good." He heard Darla's footsteps retreating down the hallway, sharp and angry. He heard the elevator ding. He heard silence return. Robert went back to the kitchen and made himself lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple, glass of water. He ate slowly, savoring the quiet. At 2 o'clock, Mary arrived. She was alone this time. No mother for backup. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Robert opened the door and stepped aside to let her in. "Everything's in the living room," he said. Mary walked past him without speaking. She stood in front of the piles of her belongings, and something in her expression broke. "This is really happening," she said softly. "Yes," Robert replied. "I thought you'd change your mind. I thought you'd realize you were being unreasonable." "I'm not being unreasonable," Robert said. "I'm being clear." Mary turned to face him. "What am I supposed to tell people? What am I supposed to tell my family?" "The truth," Robert said. "You tried to move your sister into my apartment without asking. I said no. You chose your mother's approval over our relationship. The engagement is over." "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened," Robert said. His voice stayed calm, factual. "You could dress it up however you want for your family. But that's the reality." Mary's hands trembled. "I loved you." "Past tense," Robert noted. "You said it right. Past tense." She flinched. "You're cruel." "I'm honest," Robert corrected. "There's a difference." Mary started gathering her things, shoving clothes into the garbage bags Robert had left out for her. She moved frantically, angry tears streaming down her face, her breathing harsh and uneven. Robert didn't help, didn't try to comfort her. He stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, watching, making sure she took only what was hers, making sure this ended cleanly. It took her 3 trips to carry everything down to her car. On the last trip, she stopped in the doorway. "The ring," she said. Darla was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Lower, more dangerous. "You think you're so smart," she said. "You think you can just do whatever you want because you have a piece of paper saying you own this place. But you're making an enemy of the wrong family. Robert, we take care of our own. And we remember." The threat was clear, unsubtle, almost laughable in its transparency. Robert smiled, even though Darla couldn't see him. "Is that all? You're going to regret this," Darla said. "Everyone keeps telling me that," Robert replied. "But so far, I feel pretty good." He heard Darla's footsteps retreating down the hallway, sharp and angry. He heard the elevator ding. He heard silence return. Robert went back to the kitchen and made himself lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple, glass of water. He ate slowly, savoring the quiet. At 2 o'clock, Mary arrived. She was alone this time, no mother for backup. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Robert opened the door and stepped aside to let her in. "Everything's in the living room," he said. Mary walked past him without speaking. She stood in front of the piles of her belongings, and something in her expression broke. "This is really happening," she said softly. "Yes," Robert replied. "I thought you'd change your mind. I thought you'd realize you were being unreasonable." "I'm not being unreasonable," Robert said. "I'm being clear." Mary turned to face him. "What am I supposed to tell people? What am I supposed to tell my family?" "The truth," Robert said. "You tried to move your sister into my apartment without asking. I said no. You chose your mother's approval over our relationship. The engagement is over." "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened," Robert said. His voice stayed calm, factual. "You could dress it up however you want for your family. But that's the reality." Mary's hands trembled. "I loved you." "Past tense," Robert noted. "You said it right. Past tense." She flinched. "You're cruel." "I'm honest," Robert corrected. "There's a difference." Mary started gathering her things, shoving clothes into the garbage bags Robert had left out for her. She moved frantically, angry tears streaming down her face, her breathing harsh and uneven. Robert didn't help, didn't try to comfort her. He stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, watching, making sure she took only what was hers, making sure this ended cleanly. It took her 3 trips to carry everything down her car. On the last trip, she stopped in the doorway. "The ring," she said. Robert picked up the velvet box from the coffee table and held it out. Mary took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. She looked up at him, her eyes red and desperate. "I could still fix this," she said. "I could talk to my mom. I could tell Lena she needs to find somewhere else. We could start over." Robert looked at her for a long moment. There was a part of him, a small part, a part raised to be kind and accommodating, that wanted to say yes, that wanted to give her another chance, that wanted to believe people could change. But the larger part, the part that had survived a brutal childhood and built something from nothing, knew better. "No," he said, "because this wasn't a mistake. This was who you are. And who you are is someone who doesn't respect boundaries. Someone who lets her mother control her decisions. Someone who treats her partner like an obstacle instead of an equal." Mary's face hardened. "You're going to die alone." "You said that already," Robert replied. "And I'm still not scared of it." Mary opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out. This time she didn't slam the door. She closed it quietly, like she was giving up. Robert locked it behind her. He walked to the window and watched her load the last of her things into her car. Watch her sit in the driver's seat for 5 minutes, probably crying. Watch her finally start the engine and drive away. Then he turned back to his apartment, his space, his home. It felt bigger somehow, cleaner, like something toxic had been removed. Robert spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. He vacuumed. He wiped down surfaces. He opened windows to let in fresh air despite the cold. He changed the sheets on the bed. He scrubbed the bathroom. By the time he finished, it was dark outside. The apartment smelled like pine cleaner and cold air. Every trace of Mary was gone. Every reminder of the last 14 months erased. Robert made himself dinner, pasta with marinara sauce, nothing fancy, and sat at the kitchen table eating while he scrolled through his phone. There were messages from people. Mary's friends, mostly. People he'd met at parties and dinners over the past year. The messages were predictable. Can't believe what you did to Mary. You really hurt her, you know that? She deserves better than this. Robert deleted them all without responding. These people didn't know the full story. They only knew Mary's version, filtered through tears and maternal manipulation. They didn't know about the ambush, the presumption, the inheritance clause, the choice Mary had made when she couldn't stand up to her mother. And Robert didn't owe them explanations. He finished his dinner, rinsed his plate, and sat on the couch. He picked up a book he'd been reading, something about the history of shipping routes on the Great Lakes, and tried to focus on it. But his mind kept drifting. He thought about what came next, the practical things, changing the locks, though Mary had returned her key, updating his emergency contacts, telling his supervisor at work that the wedding was off in case anyone asked, and the less practical things, the strange relief of being alone again, the way silence felt comfortable instead of threatening, the knowledge that he'd drawn a line and held it, even when it cost him something. His phone buzzed. Another message, this time from an unknown number. This is Lena, Mary's sister. I don't know what happened between you two, but my mom told me you said I can't stay with you after I have the baby. Just wanted you to know that's really messed up. I have nowhere to go now. Thanks a lot. Robert stared at the message. He could feel the attempted guilt trip in every word. The implication that he was responsible for Lena's situation, that her lack of planning was somehow his problem to solve. He typed a response. Your housing situation is not my responsibility. You have 2 months to figure something out. That's plenty of time. Good luck. He hit send, then blocked the number. Almost immediately, another message came through. Darla, this time, you just sentenced a newborn baby to homelessness. I hope you can live with that. Robert almost laughed. The manipulation was so blatant, so over the top, that it lost all effectiveness. He responded, Lena is an adult with 2 months to find housing. There are resources available. Social services, women's shelters, family members besides me. She's not helpless. She's just used to other people fixing her problems. Darla's response was instantaneous. You're heartless. Robert replied, I'm honest. There's a difference. Then he blocked her too. He set his phone down and leaned back on the couch. The apartment was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Peaceful. His. Robert closed his eyes and let himself breathe. The next week passed in a strange calm. Robert went to work, came home, lived his life. No drama. No guilt trips. No one making demands on his space or his time. It was remarkable how much energy he'd been spending just managing other people's expectations. Now that energy was his own again. On Thursday evening, his phone rang. Paul Brenner, his attorney. Robert, hey, just following up on the situation. Everything resolved. Yeah, Robert said. She took her things. Returned the key. It's done. Good. That's good. Paul paused. I also wanted to mention, I got a call from a Darla Hart yesterday. She wanted to know if she could pursue any kind of claim against you on behalf of her daughter. I told her no, obviously, but I wanted you to know she tried. Robert nodded, unsurprised. What did she say? She claimed Mary had tenant rights because she'd lived there over a year. I explained that without a lease or written agreement, and with you making a clear request for her to leave, she had no legal standing. Darla wasn't happy about it, but there's nothing she can do. Thanks for handling it, Robert said. That's what I'm here for. Oh, and one more thing. Might want to consider changing your locks anyway. Just as a precaution. You never know if she made a copy of that key. Already done, Robert said. Paul laughed. Of course you did. All right, man. Call me if anything else comes up. They ended the call. Robert sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, thinking about the kind of person who would call an attorney trying to find leverage. Trying to find some way to force their way back into a situation they'd lost. Darla was used to winning through attrition, through persistence and guilt and the sheer exhaustion of her targets. She'd probably won like that her whole life, raising daughters who couldn't say no to her, controlling her family through emotional manipulation disguised as love. But Robert wasn't her family, and he'd learned early that the only way to deal with manipulators was to refuse to play their game. That night, Robert did something he hadn't done in over a year. He called Tom Greenfield, his supervisor. "Tom, hey, it's Robert Rowan. You got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "Remember that open position in the Northern Michigan facility? The 6-month assignment? Is that still available?" There was a pause. "Yeah, actually, we haven't filled it yet." "Why, you interested?" "I am," Robert said. "I want to change. Something new. And I could use some distance from Duluth for a while." "Personal reasons?" "Yeah." "Fair enough. When could you start?" 2 weeks. Robert said. "That works. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow." "Good move, Robert. Northern Michigan's beautiful this time of year." "Well, beautiful in that frozen wilderness sort of way." Robert smiled. "That sounds perfect." He ended the call and looked around his apartment. He'd fought to keep this place. He'd ended a relationship to protect it. And now he was choosing to leave it for a while anyway. But that was different. That was his choice. On his terms. Not because someone forced him or guilt him or tried to take it from him. The apartment would be here when he got back. His sanctuary. His proof of what discipline and boundaries could build. And in the meantime, he'd have space. Distance. Room to breathe without watching for the next manipulation. Robert opened his laptop and started researching housing in Northern Michigan. Temporary rentals. Month-to-month leases. Something simple and functional while he worked the assignment. A fresh start. Not running away. Just moving towards something new. 2 weeks later, Robert stood in his apartment for the last time before leaving. Everything was packed. His car was loaded. The utilities were set to minimal usage. His mail was being forwarded. The space looked smaller with most of his personal items gone. Just furniture and the essentials. Waiting for him to return. He walked through each room once. The bedroom where he'd slept for 5 years. The kitchen where he'd learned to cook decent meals. The spare room that Mary had wanted to give away to her sister. The living room where he'd ended the relationship. This place had been his fortress, his proof, his foundation, and it still was. Nothing that had happened with Mary changed that. If anything, defending it had made it more meaningful. Robert locked the door behind him and headed downstairs. The morning was cold and clear, the sun just starting to rise over the inlet. His breath fogged in the air. He loaded the last of his things into the car, started the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he checked it. "I didn't think you'd go this far." Mary, using a different number because he'd blocked her original one. Robert looked at the message for a long moment. He could respond, could explain himself one more time, could try to make her understand. But he'd already done all that, and Mary had already made her choice. He typed a single response. "You didn't think I'd finish." Then he blocked this number too. Robert put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. He drove down Lakewood Drive, past the trees, past the inlet, away from the apartment and the drama and the people who tried to take what was his. The highway stretched ahead of him, clear and open. 6 hours to Northern Michigan, to something new, to space that was temporarily his on his own terms. Robert turned on the radio and drove. Behind him, the apartment stayed. His name on the deed, his rules in place, his future intact. He didn't regret being kind to Mary once. He'd opened his home and his life to her in good faith. But he never forgave entitlement. He never forgot the lessons learned from people who mistook kindness for weakness. And he never again mistook love for permission. The apartment would be there when he returned. A reminder that some things were worth fighting for. That boundaries mattered. That saying no was sometimes the most honest thing you could do. Robert drove north, the winter sun rising in his rearview mirror, and he felt free.